Hi, Stories Channel here.
Today we're covering a 2018 horror film called Open 24 Hours. The movie begins in a dark room, where a girl is staring at a reindeer head mounted on the wall. Meanwhile, she fills out a form for the job and marks the question about being convicted of a felony. In the interim, a man arrives there who's actually the owner of the gas station, and the girl, named Mary, is there for a job. The owner, Ed, inquires with her about her means of transport, upon which she states that her friend will drop her here. After the basic introductions, Ed asks her about her conviction. Upon that, Mary reveals that she set her boyfriend on fire, and for that, she spent some time in prison. Furthermore, she pleads for the job while mentioning her parole officer Tom Dugan. As the owner hears the name, he states that he knows Tom. Mary pleads for the job once again, and after some consideration, Ed agrees to have her on. Happiness springs upon her face as soon as she gets the confirmation. Ed defines that she'll have to work from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. and it will be a night shift. Moreover, he asks her to be here at 9:30 so that someone can teach her about the cash register. Mary agrees to everything without a single complaint. Afterward, she leaves the gas station and meets her friend Debbie, who's waiting for her in the car. Mary tells her the good news that she has secured the job, and the girls decide to celebrate at 12:30. In the meantime, Mary has to meet with her parole officer at 11, so Debbie drops her off at her place. She enters the house and proceeds towards the washroom, but as soon as she opens the door, she becomes horror-stricken as she witnesses a man brutalizing a young girl and dunking her head in the water. Mary becomes frozen in one spot as the man named James asks her if you like to watch, right? With that, he lifts up his hammer and hits the girl on the head until she starts bleeding. Mary couldn't bear the sight, so she immediately closes the door and takes out some anti-delusional pills. As her breathing calms down, she's suddenly startled by Tom, who has just entered the house. He then checks the bathroom, upon which we see that there's nobody in it. Tom then takes Mary away and starts giving her instructions. He tells her to keep in continuous contact and to use the telephone, otherwise, things will become difficult for her, and she can go to jail again. After strictly advising her, Tom leaves. Following the visit, Mary walks to the park to meet up with Debbie. She stands at a shelter and starts smoking a cigarette when suddenly she notices someone in a raincoat standing a few hundred feet away, staring at her. The fear rises up in her as James starts rushing towards her. Struck by horror, she turns away and suddenly comes face to face with Debbie. Upon her sight, she takes a sigh of relief, and when she looks back, there's nobody to see. Up next, we see both the friends at a cafe eating burgers. Debbie asks her about her job and wishes her the best of luck for it. After a while, Mary shares that according to her, she thought she saw James earlier. Upon her delusion, Debbie assures her that James is in jail. Moreover, she should focus on herself and keep taking the medications. Just then, Mary starts visualizing a girl who's bleeding constantly from her head. She becomes extremely frightened, but Debbie shakes her out of the delusion. Afterward, they both get up from the table and we see that the girl is completely fine. Following lunch, Mary goes home and connects her phone. After a while, she gets a call from Tom, who's glad about her compliance and wishes her the best of luck for the job. As soon as the phone is put down, it rings again, but this time, there's a woman on the other side of the line who threatens Mary by stating, "You watch my daughter die. Now I'm going to watch you die." Fright crawls in Mary's bones as she instantly cuts the call and disconnects the wire, but it rings again. Much to her fear, she throws the phone on the ground and walks away. Later that night, Debbie picks her up and decides to go with her to the gas station on Mary's first night of the job. During their drive, Mary mentions that it's supposed to rain tonight and starts singing the song Raindrops. When Debbie stops her, she states that whenever it rained, James would call her and play this song. That's how she knew he was going to eliminate someone. Debbie then tries to console her and motivates her for her first day. After some time, they reach the Deer Market gas station and Debbie becomes reluctant as the place is in the middle of nowhere. Nevertheless, they decide to go in. As soon as both the girls get out, it starts raining heavily. Upon entering the market, they meet with a guy named Bobby who teaches Mary about the basics of the cashing register and how to scan the items. In the interim, Debbie brings a pack of beer and buys some cigarettes, which Mary scans and successfully finalizes the transaction. After a high five, Bobby leaves to get the keys and Debbie goes away as well. Outside, she sits in the car and smokes a cigarette. Suddenly, we witness somebody in a raincoat standing at a distance, holding a hammer. Debbie slides down her window to get the smoke out when suddenly a hammer gets smashed into her face and the culprit drags her away into the pouring night. In the meantime, Bobby returns with the keys and guides Mary to the bathrooms and everything else. He then writes his phone number on a page, just in case she needs anything. With that being done, he wishes the best of luck to Mary and leaves the mart. Afterward, she takes a tour of the whole market. She visits the aisles, walks her way to the back office, checks the storage, and strolls into the locker rooms. After her quick tour, she comes outside to smoke. As she's taking the puffs, the camera pans to the side to reflect the person in the raincoat, standing behind her. Mary hears a noise behind her as well, and when she turns, there's nobody to be found. Therefore, she goes back into the mart to take a look inside, but it's empty as well. Just then, the telephone rings and there's a woman on the other side who asks, "How long till you are open?" Upon which Mary answers, "Open 24 hours. As soon as the call ends, the phone rings again and it's the same woman asking the same question. Much to Mary's horror, the phone rings for the third time and now, the woman says, "You like to watch people die," upon which Mary becomes scared to death and instantly cuts the call. Afterward, she leaves a voice message for Debbie to instantly call her back. In the meantime, she hears a thud from the other side. She then walks through the aisles and storage to check if there's anything, but she finds nobody there. Her search takes her to the back office and the bathroom, where she takes a moment for herself. Unfortunately, the bells ring the next instant, so she runs to the counter. Meanwhile, outside, there's a truck parked for gas. The trucker walks inside and tells the amount of gas. After filling up, he grabs a beer and starts flirting with Mary. She deliberately becomes stern with him and tells him the bill. The trucker gives the credit card and leaves without it. Mary runs after him, but he has already driven away. But to her most horrific surprise, Mary witnesses a burning man on the other side of the road who's walking towards her. She becomes scared to death and accidentally punches Bobby, who's coming up behind her. After many apologies, she takes him inside and treats the bleeding area of his mouth. Bobby then states that he's here to check up on her by Ed's instructions. Mary then tells him about the trucker and his leftover credit card, upon which Bobby tells her that he used to have an affair with the last receptionist, therefore he left the card here on purpose. Mary becomes disgusted with the idea and sits on the counter. Bobby then asks her about her time in prison, and there, the story unravels and Mary tells him about James and why she burned him. She reveals that her boyfriend was James Lincoln Field, who used to take girls off during the rains, by some thought of purifying their souls. He took the lives of 35 women in total. Mary then narrates that one day she returns from the job to find the basement flooded, and in that water, she finds the human corpses. Meanwhile, James is behind her and already waiting for her. From that day onward, he made her watch every murder, until the night when an 18-year-old, Christine Rogers, was eliminated. That was the ending point for Mary, and therefore, she put the house on fire. Unfortunately, James survived and she did as well. As her story ends, Bobby receives a call and leaves. In the meantime, a young couple enters the mart. The girl walks towards the bathrooms while the kid buys some liquor with a fake ID. Just as Mary is cashing it, the phone rings and on the call plays the song, Raindrops. Horror crawls in her bones and she instantly puts the cradle back. The couple leaves hurriedly and Mary recoils in fear. Meanwhile, outside, Bobby's truck gets stalled in the middle of the road and he gets out to check the engine. Much to his bad luck, the raincoat slayer creeps up behind him and knocks him out with the hammer. On the other hand, Mary scurries to the bathroom on the outside. When she enters the toilet cabin, she finds strands of hair in the stagnant toilet water and an ID. Much to her fright, it's Debbie's ID, and suddenly a hand emerges from the toilet and grabs her wrist. Desolated with fear, Mary yanks herself away and falls back. To her sheer panic, the toilet starts overflowing with blood and suddenly, a bloodied Debbie appears beside her, begging to be saved. Mary clenches her head and Debbie disappears. But another shock of horror is given to her as two hands break the wall and try to grab her. But in the end, it was all her illusions. When she comes out of the bathroom, she meets Tom on her way in. He's there to check on her. After the brief talk, he asks about the way to the bathroom, and when he leaves, Mary returns to the counter. Just then, someone enters the mart and it turns out to be James, in his raincoat. Mary tries to convince herself that he's not real, upon which James slaps her hard across the face. That makes her realize that he's very much real. She stands completely flabbergasted as James explains that he's here to see how she's getting along. Moreover, he defines that she's going to watch many people die tonight and she'll like it. Mary is extremely disturbed and she starts crying. With the urge to prove that he's not real, she closes her eyes and opens them again to witness a woman standing there in the raincoat. Mary takes a sigh of relief and receives the money for the gas. But just before leaving, the woman asks how long till you are open. That makes Mary extremely angry and she starts shouting at her and blaming her. Tom arrives there just at the moment and lets the woman go. Mary then reveals that somebody has been threatening her by phone and this woman is that person. Tom scolds her for not informing him and leaves while advising her to be more vigilant about it. Up next, Mary is at the counter when Debbie's car arrives. She gets out to see it and to her horror, she sees a blood-splattered message written on the windscreen stating, "You like to watch." Mary gets scared and immediately runs back inside. There, she leaves a voice message for Tom to call her instantly. Afterward, she tries to call 911 but soon realizes that the car is an illusion of her mind as well. That gives her an idea to call Bobby, but when she dials the number, his phone starts ringing nearby. Mary's breath is lost as fear starts to crawl in her body. Meanwhile, she hears a noise from somewhere and she follows it to a back storage area where, to her horror, she witnesses Debbie and Bobby tied to a chair. She gets scared and runs back, where she crashes into the same woman in the raincoat. Mary asks for help and runs to the counter to call the police, but the phone seems dead. The woman then puts up the photo of Christine Rogers and states that she wants revenge. With that, she takes out a knife and slashes Mary's hand and arm. Afterward, a fight breaks out between them and Mary escapes to the storage. The woman follows her there as well and tries to break the door, but Mary shatters a glass bottle in her head and knocks her down. Unfortunately, the woman does not back away and attacks Mary again, while climbing on her chest. Just as she's about to stab her, Tom arrives and eliminates her by shooting her. After saving her life, they're both talking about the circumstances when suddenly James comes up from behind and knocks both of them out by a hammer blow. Following the fade-out, Mary finds herself tied to a chair while the rest of the people are in front of her. James menacingly threatens and drags a huge mallet into the room. He then uses it to finish off Tom. Meanwhile, Bobby and Debbie also wake up and cry in fear. James then uses his unhuman nature to eliminate Debbie by strangling her with a plastic bag. Tears of agony flood Mary's face as she watches her friend die. Meanwhile, James bathes Bobby with gasoline, and just as he flares up the lighter, the trucker returns. As the man enters the mart, James drags the body away, leaving a trail of blood. On the other hand, Mary frees herself and uses Bobby's guidance to take a shotgun out of the lockers. Meanwhile, the trucker roams around the empty mart until he comes across the trail of blood. He instantly calls 911 and informs them about the situation. Afterward, he walks towards the end of the hall. Meanwhile, Bobby and Mary get ready with the shotgun. Just before the trucker can open the door, James comes up from behind and hits him. Furthermore, Mary fires the shotgun as well, ultimately finishing off the guy. She becomes scared, but Bobby takes her to the side as James is also there. After a series of hiding and seek, James eliminates Bobby and Mary is on the run again. Just at that moment, a cop arrives there and Mary runs outside to seek refuge. She states that James Lincoln Field is here, upon which the cop allows her to get inside the car. Unfortunately, before they can drive away, James arrives there and shoots the cop in the head. Mary instantly runs away and the cat and mouse chase begins. James chases her and she hides herself in the office. There she finds the reindeer mount, and she plunges its antlers into James's body, eventually finishing him off. In the final moments of the film, we see the station in a very devastating state, with bodies lying here and there along with the blood. Meanwhile, Mary is working in a salon now and the movie comes to an end. Thanks for watching, guys.